Welcome back to another episode of the GODCAST, brought to you by the Existence Project by the Review of Religions magazine. So today, we're planning on talking about some of the most demanded topics we've gotten, and everything from the beginning of the universe to its end. And of course, as you all may have heard up to this point, the multiverse. It's been popularized in media, and even with the recent pop culture, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, I know the youth have a new rejuvenation to look back at some of the history of modern physics. And right at your door is going to be the questions in relationship to how this all started and where we're headed, and is it going to end? So for our guest in this season, you need to know introduction at this time, but we have Sabahat Ali Sahib, who is the editor of the Existence Project on the Review of Religions and a missionary for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community living in Silicon Valley. Sabahat, welcome again.
Jazakallah, great to be back, Munib.
So I think we're going to start with what I consider to be the most interesting bit of this all, which is I've heard a lot. I mean, initially I got into it because of Spider-Man, but I've heard a lot about the multiverse. Like, what is this? I mean, people talk about the multiverse as if it's a proposition that can nullify the argument of a creator. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are, because if it's the case that multiple universes exist with multiple realities, does that really do away with the idea of a creator?
Well, that's I guess that's one of the big questions. It's interesting where sci-fi and Multiverse of Madness and into the Multiverse and all these different movies and everything like that, they're repopularizing this, which, by the way, was, credit to the original comics, because that's how
Right.
old these topics actually are, right? So credit to the people who used to write comics, people like Stan Lee, the original genii of this entire enterprise, because they're the ones who really brought to the masses in the West, in many ways, this concept of the multiverse theory. But it goes all the way back, to Greek mythology as well. There are different worlds and different realms. And really, if you look at it in one way, religion is the origin story of the multiverse theory, and actually in many ways. For example, the idea that there is a spiritual realm alongside the physical realm, that I have a soul alongside my body. Well, that's a very interesting concept that falls squarely into the concept of a multiverse. And that's a multiverse that humanity has been grappling with for millennia, very seriously. And then another one version of the multiverse, or aspect of the multiverse that religion, since antiquity, has proposed, is the idea of an afterlife, another world, literally, right? Whether it's the stage of purgatory, where, according to, for example, Islam, the soul will evolve. Like, I was just watching a really great TED Talk the other day by a leading physicist, Sabine Hadenfelder, I think, German. And she talks about how we need to stop pretending that information can be destroyed. It can't. Now, this is really interesting. This is her speaking from the perspective of physics.
Right.
And, well, that opens the door to the idea of multiverses in a very curious way. And some people watching might think, okay, this person is, he's a theologian, and theologians should kind of be afraid of this idea of the multiverse, because the relevance here is that a lot of new atheists like to use the multiverse as one of their favorite get-out-of-jail-free cards. What they'll say, for example, Dawkins has said very famously many times, he'll say, once the overwhelming presence of design in the universe is established, where the design came from, that's a separate conversation, connected but separate. But bear with me for a moment. And when the incredibly, almost incalculably low probability of everything that has happened is presented, it all being chance, it all being random, and then you realize it's not just one random occurrence that was extremely improbable and incalculably almost improbable, it's every step that was taken from the inception of 13.8 billion years ago, the universe, the Big Bang, whatever theory that you postulate, whether it's cosmic inflation, whatever it is, following the Big Bang up until today, there's so much design. Some new atheists, especially Dawkins, loves to brush it under the rug and call it the appearance of design. But what you can't call the appearance of blank is functionality. If there's random design that serves no purpose, you can say yes. But when there's specific, minute functionality, and then there's functionality of each organ, and there's functionality of each cell, and everything is falling together, at what point is it scientific to say, oh, that's just the appearance of functionality? It's not logically tenable. It is functionality. So let's go with the word functionality. When there's that level of functionality in this universe, what a lot of new atheists will say is, well, the thing is, this is not the only universe. And Dawkins has argued this. So for example, Dawkins says that if, and this is a quote I have from one of his talks, you can go to YouTube and see the entire talk. After speaking for about 3 minutes, he goes, quote, if the universe, the constants of the universe are indeed fine-tuned, how do we explain it? How do we explain the appearance that the universe is fine-tuned to bring us into existence? Well, theists say, these are Dawkins' words, God did it. And I was watching this, and I was like, surely he's not going to reduce the entire literature predicated on belief and theology to 3 words. But unfortunately, that's what he does. He goes, God did it. And then he follows it up by saying, well, that, of course, is no explanation at all. And I was like, yes, Professor Dawkins, of course that's not an explanation. Right. I'm a believer in God. I don't even posit it like that God did it.
Yeah.
And this is
you
another
don't have
trope.
to take the argument seriously at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it goes to show that the individual is, in this case, Richard Dawkins, he's not serious about the truth because he's not presenting any case. He knows full well that there's a very emphatic case. And the reason we know this, Munib, is that we have on record innumerable scientists who have admitted that for decades, scientists knew that believing that the universe is eternal is very important. Because if we believe that the universe was eternal or is eternal, then it's had plenty of time to do whatever subatomic acrobatics and gymnastics that it needs to do, and every single eventuality that could have been got an opportunity to exist, right? Okay. Then with the realization, the discovery of the Big Bang, and I should call it the prevalence, when the Big Bang theory became prevalent, well, that became a real problem because now the universe has a beginning. And if the universe has a beginning, and we'll get into, why we believe that the universe, whether it's the second law of thermodynamics or it's the microwave background radiation or various other pieces of evidence that are quoted, we know the universe has an end for various reasons, entropy and stuff, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But if the universe has a beginning and an end, and it's subject to a few billion years, then suddenly you can't just brazenly say, oh, the universe has always been there, so it's had plenty of time to do all of this, right? Now, there's another opportunity. Now what they say, and this is where Dawkins says, we are just a bubble in a sea foam of bubbles. Yep. Okay? Meaning that our universe is just one of not infinite, they won't say it, but they'll say a huge number of universes. And it's like a few of those bubbles, a tiny minority, he keeps using this in this speech, he says, a tiny minority of those bubbles are specified to be the way that our universe is. And one of those universes has to be fine-tuned for life because here we are. Please listen to this. This is literally his next line. He goes, now, remember he's an evolutionary biologist. He's not an authority on physics, with due respect to his academic accolades. He says, now, physicists find this not only implausible, but they actually think it's a bit of a cop-out. So he's quoting a theory postulated by physicists, and then quoting physicists saying that it is highly implausible and that it's a cop-out. And
well,
then
at least he got that part right.
yes, well, at least he's being honest about what he's quoting. And then he says, I actually think it's a rather elegant explanation. Listen to how he concludes. He says, and I was waiting. I was like, okay, he's going to give a profound reason for why he, as a person who is not an expert in physics, has a better explanation than most of the physics community. He goes, and I'm quoting, I don't mean to be disrespectful, and he goes, and it's probably true. That's it. That's it. And watch that video. You can see in his eyes, he's realizing, what did I just say? I cannot continue this. And then he goes, but let's move on to another argument. Yeah. So this is from the horse's mouth. This is one occasion, and Dawkins has spoken about it in detail in the God Delusion and everything. But I want to just quote the way that these arguments are presented. And so he says that, look, there are an infinite number of universes, or a large enough number of universes, and one of them is ours, and so it's not a big deal.
Yeah, and so before we get into this universe, which seems to be what this topic's coming towards, I just want to cover some of these systems that people have developed, and in terms of models for the multiverse, right? And I think it's important because it'll help situate the viewers on what type of theories, and that's what they are, theories, have been posited thus far by some of the physicists, but more, and I'll tell you why later, but more as a philosophical statement than any type of calculated scientific experiment. And the one you touched on, like these bubbles that kind of form, which, with all due respect, at least it respects an origin. That's known as cosmic inflation, or taken to its extreme, eternal inflation, which says that there's quantum fluctuations happening. The horizon, there's like a radial flat universe that's spreading. And at such a rapid rate of inflation, what you get is these bubbles or patches that create separate universes with completely separate physical properties. Now, okay, let's put that one to the side because we're going to come back to the origin story on that. But there's even more situations. Like the viewers probably have heard of Schrodinger's cat, right? And it was more of a thought experiment getting at this same quantum paradox, as you can think of it. But the idea is that in that experiment, there was you can think of it. It's usually in relationship to only subatomic particles. You can think of it as a cat next to a radioactive subatomic particle, next to a meter that can measure the radioactive decay. So the moment that is measured and you look in the box, there's a 50% probability that the cat is dead or alive. But if you look into quantum mechanics and the calculations of superposition that they've done, well, there's actually something known as the gray zone. So the cat could be dead or alive. And they've separated this into separate universes, meaning that any possibility is a possibility. So this is known as the many worlds hypothesis. Where
any possibility is technically its own universe, branches off into its own universe. Like, for example, one way, like it's not exactly Schrodinger's cat, but it's so close to it that for me, as I remember, like a young student, I was able to understand it. So they basically gave the example, I remember in like a video, and it stuck with me, that let's say that there's a basketball hoop behind you, right? And you take the basketball and you throw it behind you. Every single angle that it could possibly take, every single trajectory, every single possibility that it could take exists. That's also important, right? It exists. Yes. And it will take a trajectory in this universe, but in all other universes, it will take a different trajectory, and they're just as real as this one.
Yeah, exactly. So you can imagine that, like in that example where you're measuring radioactive decay, that's some arbitrary measurement as an observer. So all of this requires observation, right? Because we're measuring. Yeah. But our eyes are observers, our ears are observers, and it's not just me that's an observer, we're all observers. So you can imagine pretty much at every nanosecond of measurement, there's an infinity almost, an infinity arising out of infinities. But they always move forward. They never move back. So one of the problems that I've encountered with this is it doesn't address origin at all, because it still moved forward. The infinities arose out of infinities. So you'll have all these parallel universes where all these crazy things are happening, including Richard Dawkins probably being a Muslim in one of these universes. That's also a possibility. But or admitting that he was mistaken about the multiverse. But all these universes are exponentially increasing with time. So one thing I find interesting about that is, well, that's a very much a faith-driven hypothesis, right? And I think we touched a little bit on this in the first episode, is this obsession with the multiverse, to me at least, seems a bit faith-driven, right? Because right now there's
faith-driven, like extremely faith-driven. In fact, I would say it's, look, if a religious person within the paradigm of Islam is proposing that there's the concept of an afterlife, where whatever form it takes, our actions are accountable, and they will face the music on some moral scale, cosmic scale, whatever, in the next life. That's one universe we're talking about. And let's say there's a good place and a bad place, right? That's two universes. And let's say that my soul is existing in a different realm than my body. That's 4 universes, okay? That's 4 universes. Here, we're postulating an infinite series of universes. And it's funny that I am asked as a believer, show me the evidence. I want to show the evidence. I do argue, and that's something that we'll get to, I'm sure. I do argue that there's evidence, but there's not even an inkling, a modicum, a shred of evidence for an infinite number of these universes at all, right? So I just wanted to point that out, that hypocrisy needs to be acknowledged as well.
Yeah, of course, because, well, if you didn't believe that it was true, if it wasn't a philosophical position rather than a scientific system, right? Yeah. Because empirical knowledge alone can't derive that there's other universes. So the faith needs to be there in the scientific community for them to want to pursue to do it. Yeah. But, like I think we posited this again in that first episode, is imagine if people even gave an ounce of that faith, instead of investigating all these infinite universes and whether they exist or not, or whether, there's other theories, whether everything is just structure and mathematics. Yeah. That's all the universes, or whether we live in a simulation, right?
Yeah.
Like
that's one of the most popular ones. It's because of the,
that is one of the most popular ones, but it was funny because Dr. George Ellis, he's a cosmologist, he referred to that theory in general as late night pub discussion, right? But there's people where you'll enter these debates and they'll genuinely posit this with firm conviction. I'm not going to say firm affirmation, but a genuine amount of conviction as a alternative to the idea of religion and faith. And here we are, as technology is advancing in our professional lives, and as I've already mentioned in the past, I'm here feeling like I'm walking on eggshells, talking about whether or not there's a creator, whether or not I believe in angels, whether or not I believe in a soul. And those same people will make you feel like you're a part of a different class of society if you believe any of those things. Those are the same people who are positing these theories as alternative explanations to what brought us about. And I respect it to some degree, because there are many, many people out there that have not even cared to wonder about our origin seriously enough. And I don't blame them. It's part and parcel of this modern atheistic doctrine where people are almost being forbidden to have that human curiosity. Yeah. I don't know if you felt the same.
Yeah. Well, I speak to people all the time about this. I do want to come back to one thing. You mentioned about the origin, and maybe some listeners are wondering, like, what does the origin have to do with it? The multiverse is a distraction in many ways. And one of those ways is that it tries to take away from another blank wall, or rather I should say a brick wall that atheists face. That is, why is there something rather than nothing? That's important. And there are new atheists who have actually tried to say that, look, things do come from nothing. Because we normally say, you should show us anything in the universe that is spontaneously arising from absolute nothing. For us to normalize the idea of, oh yeah, the universe came from nothing, that's a normal thing. It's not. The burden of proof is on the person who wants to say that it's normal for the universe to have decided, without having the intelligent capacity to decide, apparently, at one point, that there should be something rather than nothing. So this idea has been floating around that quantum theory can somehow demonstrate a causeless, spontaneous creation from something from nothing. Professor Paul Davies put it beautifully, and I quote him. He says, "The processes represented in the quantum theory and all attached theories do not represent the creation of matter out of nothing, but the conversion of pre-existing energy into material form." This is interesting. We still have to account for where the energy came from in the first place. Quantum physics, and this is really interesting, quantum physics has to exist in some sense so that a quantum transition can generate the cosmos in the first place. Remember what you said? Apparently, mathematics is its own universe. The fact that 1 + 1 = 2, that's also a theory, very popular theory. The fact that 1 + 1 = 2, that reality exists independently as in its own universe. So that means that if there were laws with which this universe was going to be governed, the thing is, I'm just giving an example of when you start taking into account these multiverse theories, those people who think that they're resolving the issue and trying to take away the idea of God, they're causing more problems for themselves than they're resolving. Because that means that a hypothetical universe where our 4 fundamental or 6 fundamental constants, the 6 famous numbers that work perfectly together, they hypothetically had to exist in a universe of hypothetics in order for them to translate in a physical way, to manifest in a physical way in this universe, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to play this hypothetical game where it's just acrobatics and gymnastics of the most ridiculous proportions. So that's why we say, as believers in the Holy Quran, let's at least stick to what we can measure in this universe. And how ironic that we're trying to pull these people back to say, can we keep things measurable and observable and tangible a little bit?
Yeah. And of course, I mean, as a scientist myself, I can appreciate good-hearted, productive, and genuine scientific enterprise. But the problem with some of this is that this is more of a personal sentiment. Sometimes I find it a bit of an act of rebellion to say some of these statements. I mean, even from a functionality perspective that we were kind of alluding to earlier, there's so much that we don't even understand about our universe. And now we're here postulating about the physical attributes of other universes and whether or not you can develop a space-time funnel between them to investigate them and all of this stuff. And to some degree, it seems a little departed from reality, right? Like it's kind of the same thing people would say initially about Elon Musk. They were like, come on, why are you thinking about Mars? Let's figure out poverty here on Earth first. So I think there's a bit of a stepwise approach you can take to some of these problems. And I think that hypotheses in science need to be attached to popular and societal struggle. And they always need to keep that in mind. And the things that concern us the most need to be prioritized. Now, we've talked a little bit, to my second point, we've talked a little bit about origin, but what about the end of the universe? Because that's something that's equally as exciting. And I know it's a concept from even like third century BC, which says the world eternally expired and regenerated. And I know that people take this and they're looking at that and saying, well, is that proof for a multiverse or is that proof for something else? And I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that in relationship to that principle of entropy and thermodynamics you brought up.
That's extremely, it's a vast subject that is so beyond any one human being's scope to encapsulate. But
well, I can provide a little bit of an introduction, and then maybe I'll get your thoughts on what you think about this. So, and this is actually
can I say one thing, by the way?
Of course, yeah.
So you were talking, because before we close this discussion about origin and everything, I just want to ask a question, and I ask this question to myself, and I feel like I want to challenge something very fundamental here. I've spoken to now countless youth. There's a certain category of youth, and then a certain mentality within adults who have raised people, the celebrity atheists, to these super pedestals. Like these super pedestals, right? And the reason this is relevant here is, you know how you said that, or how we discussed that atheists will try to brush the entire question of origin under the rug?
Just completely do away with it,
do away with it, as though it doesn't even matter anymore, even though it is actually the singular, most important question of all religious and scientific inquiry since antiquity. And they'll use the multiverse to do that about the heavens. Well, isn't that the same thing that they've done with evolution on Earth, where they will try to use evolution? They have weaponized the general population's ignorance of evolution as a process that describes the way, the means, the how for how a unicellular organism came to be whatever creatures exist today, right? And they'll describe the process, but I just want to make one thing very clear. This entire narrative of evolution, because we've talked about the skies, I wanted to just bring it back to the earth, if that's okay for a moment. This entire debate of the fact that God doesn't exist, where did the fissure, the crack begin? Intellectually, although many historians argue that it was almost a strictly socio-political enterprise, New Atheism. But intellectually, let's go back to Darwin. Darwin says, okay, the fossil records that I'm finding and the patterns of, a finch's beak, etc., different animals, they are inconsistent with the idea of creationism. 6,000 years, it wasn't enough time. And then, that's where it began. That's when people were like, hold on. And pair this with what was happening in that era of how people were rejecting just a socio-political monarchy, an empire that claimed to be from God, right? Pair these things together, we forget, when what happens is when there's an entire classroom that's, let's say, God forbid, this entire classroom that's fighting, right? And then when you trace your steps back, you realize that it all began with these two kids. And the saddest thing is, if you find out that those two kids started scrapping because of a misunderstanding. That is, we have to remember this, that is what's happened. All these wars that are being fought about God versus no God, or the God particle versus the Higgs boson, or this theory or that theory, or whether we came from nothingness. We are all in the business of, as human beings, in utter awe of the genius of the universe. And we all want to know what that origin story is. Everyone on both sides or whatever sides of the debate, right? And when you go back to it, you realize, actually, this misunderstanding that happened between the modern Christological postulations from the Bible of what God and religion are. Islam, and I have to say this, we've said this before, never had an issue with evolution. Muslim scholars used to be mocked by Christian scholars before Darwin for the Quranic belief in evolution and the stages of life, from lower life forms to higher consciousness. So when there became available evidence for evolution, the Muslim world, who was educated, was very happy. They're like, hey, this is great. We believe in God. We believe in science. We brought about, it was Islam that brought about the Muslims who were at the forefront of the scientific golden age, which preceded the Christian, the European Renaissance by hundreds of years. As a result of the endorsements, mind you, of Islam, these are Muslims who are praying 5 times a day, very saintly figures, many of them, extremely religious, and yet they are the ones coming up with algebra, right? I just wanted to make this point in the narrative because I think we've forgotten, Munib, before we get into the various arguments about like the fact that Islam never had an issue. Now we're talking about like the Big Bang, okay? The Holy Quran mentions it. We have to say that, right? The Big Bang that we've mentioned earlier in this episode and in this season, the Holy Quran mentions it. And then the expanding universe, well, the Holy Quran is the only scripture in history that mentions that we are the ones who brought this universe from a state of non-existence into existence, bi'aydan, with great, great power. Wa inna la musi'un. We are the ones who continue to go on expanding it, right? And then people forget. They'll be like, oh yeah, okay, fine. There are descriptions of a Big Bang-like thing in mythology as well. I'm like, okay, show me a single line in the history of human literature where not only is it casually mentioned that there was a Big Bang, that the universe, the heavens and the earth and everything that you see in between used to be a tiny closed up mass, and that it was caused to be blown asunder, and that is being expanded. And in the same breath as that verse about the Big Bang, God Almighty, who I believe to be the author of the Holy Quran, casually just states, by the way, all of life came from water. Like, I just want to create, a little bit of context for viewers. So from a Muslim perspective, none of these have ever been problems. And we come to multiverse, and I'll close with this. You and I know that God Almighty, who claims to be the author of the Holy Quran, also starts off the book by literally calling himself what? The Lord of every universe. The word alam is used in Arabic and Urdu. It refers to a universe, the universe. And the plural of universe, universes, is used at the very beginning. And you know what's funny? You know what's actually brilliant? The word that God uses for himself in the Holy Quran is Rabb. He is the Lord of all the universes. The word Rabb refers to an entity that brings everything from a state of non-existence into existence, then specifies exactly what is needed for its development, then ensures that through a process of evolution, it continues to evolve to higher and higher, scaling higher and higher heights, not just of complexity and design. This is where the Holy Quran fundamentally disagrees, but of functionality and consciousness. Of functionality and consciousness. You can't say there's an illusion of consciousness or there's an illusion of functionality. Those are incontrovertible realities. And on one side, remember, he says, I'm the Rabb, the one who does all these things, of Alameen, all the universes. So the two main things that have been used, evolution and on the earth and the multiverse theory in the heavens, to try to say that there is no God, are literally done away with at the beginning of the Holy Quran in the first words that God Almighty introduces himself. So I just want to give the audience a little bit of context of where we stand with these things.
That was very beautifully said. And I think that allows me the opportunity to clarify a few points earlier. I think scientific ideas in themselves are generally meant for benefiting humankind. Yeah. And I think that's a very noble enterprise. Absolutely. So when people state their ideas on evolution or state their ideas on the multiverse, I mean, in and of themselves, they're benign ideas. And you can present them either with the goodwill of humankind in mind, or you can present them in a way that, might be disingenuous. So I don't have a problem with the multiverse as an idea, as something we should ponder over as a possibility. I don't have the problem with evolution, of course. It's just that when people use this sleight of hand, and I think although we started with multiverse and we went to evolution, I mean, it began with evolution, right? Yeah. And then when we come to the idea of fine-tuned by design, we look at our human body and we get mesmerized by the creation around us. Well, that's where the sleight of hand happened, where people are like, well, this actually happens to be the universe where it was fine-tuned. In other universes, life didn't persist. So it almost, like, the ideas in and of themselves, I think, are good ideas that we should ponder over as scientists, as human beings that are interested in the pursuit of knowledge. Yeah. But we have to be careful that we don't weaponize our ideas as an ideology against another ideology. Just to pick the people.
Science is not weaponized And
Exactly.
ideological weaponization is, it's as ancient as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And
Yeah.
to relate, just so the viewers, watching this, you brought up a few things in that talk about what the Holy Quran has to say about the origin story, the Big Bang, the expansion of the universe.
Oh, by the way, sorry, I totally forgot to add. Can I add one more line?
Of course, go right in. Yeah.
You know how I love when people ask me, and they're like, "Oh my God, why do you follow this ancient book?" Everyone's heard it, right? And they'll always be like, "I don't need an ancient book." I'm like, "Why do I follow this ancient book? This is why. Show me a single piece of literature in the history of humankind that possesses just these 4 things out of the thousands, just these 4 things. You don't have one." So at the very least, the principles of scientific inquiry impel us that if I am even remotely unbiased, I need to crack open this book and see for myself. Right? Yeah. That's why.
No, I think that is a really important and powerful point. And going back to what I wanted to mention about the viewers watching this, the invention of the Hubble telescope, where they have essentially determined that the universe is expanding, goes right in hand in hand with what you had just mentioned. And then when we look at the trace elements, which can be calculated back to be the product of that single star or atom that had exploded, goes right back to hydrogen, right? Like there was compressed hydrogen, helium, trace products and whatnot. But it's very interesting because you had mentioned earlier that the origin of it all was water. So, hydrogen, right? Yeah. And it's interesting that no matter what scientific discoveries, with this level of certainty at least, come out, it always points towards the same answer, never contradicting. Another thing that before I forget that I wanted to mention was, as we were talking about origin, we have to wonder, well, and, theories of this exist out there that, okay, fine, we had an origin, but we are here to eternally continue, which, as a theory, like as a pure logic, doesn't make sense to me personally. And that's not even coming as a physicist. That's just coming as someone who's trying to logically deduce the thought process that goes behind that. Yeah. And so let's talk about entropy once more. We were getting to that, and I think it's a very interesting point. So the 4th caliph of our community had written a very powerful book called Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth. There's a specific chapter on this concept of entropy. It's very interesting because, as we've learned it in school, entropy is the disorderliness, the chaos, the randomness that happens as time progresses. So you can imagine a cup of water, for example. As it's hot, over time it transfers energy into a cooler form. And until it reaches a state of equilibrium, there's energy that's released and there's disorder happening in the universe. And some of that is actually lost and never recoverable. So the idea, and you can Google this if you want, is called the heat death of the universe. It was actually initially proposed by Lord Kelvin, who was a very, very astounding physicist. And the idea is that over time, either we would reach absolute zero, like in the Kelvin meter, or we would reach eventually, it could be in eternally, I don't mean eternal in the literal sense, but eternally long time, but it should reach a state of equilibrium where no more processes can happen after that. Yeah. Which, it basically, as the law of thermodynamics as we know it, puts a full stop on this idea of an eternal universe. Yeah. Which is really interesting because people find different ways to kind of get around this idea.
Yeah, the Holy Quran lays down a very fundamental principle. It's a very humbling principle. And that is, Kullu man alayha fan. Every single particle of this universe will eventually come to its end. And what entropy shows us, first, I'll share my favorite example of entropy because I feel like we can literally not come up with enough examples to understand what entropy is. Some people say entropy is the name for the science of chaos, right? Yeah. That sounds really cool. That's, and that's really kind of what it is, right? Others say no, entropy has to do with disorderliness, the level of organization that exists at a subatomic level. When that organization or the capacity for those subatomic particles to be organized, that is reduced, then entropy increases, right? Remember, the more entropy increases, the less of the universe we have, right? Then others say, like you said, that with the transfer of energy, what entropy says is that when something is lost, it cannot be energy that is lost. So let's say that there is a reaction between two compounds, right? Some energy is lost. That energy can never be recovered again. But interestingly enough,
spontaneously,
yeah. Yeah. But interestingly enough, how this applies to the universe, for anyone who's wondering, I'm sure anyone who's watching is probably read up on entropy and enjoys like those videos about how the universe will end, right? One seems to prop up on YouTube every 2 weeks. I watch them ravenously myself. So basically the idea is that let's take a star or galaxies, right? So firstly, dark energy is spreading galaxies apart, even though the law of gravitation should have dictated that they should be coming together. But while within certain smaller systems of stars, gravity is bringing things together, yet in the bigger picture, dark energy is stretching the universe apart. And so there are two things to bear in mind. One is the law of entropy, where if there are two hot objects, right? I'll give you an example. When we go grocery shopping, I haven't heard this example before. And obviously no example is going to perfectly encapsulate entropy for the sticklers who are watching and saying, well, there's this aspect, not in this illustration. But when we have let's say we have an ice cream haul, but for that one person in the summer who needs to get their hot pumpkin spice latte, even when it's still 35 degrees centigrade, in middle of August, would you put the latte in the bag of ice creams? Probably not. Why wouldn't you? This is entropy, how we use entropy in our daily lives. What'll happen? Will the ice cream ever increase in its coldness? No. When there's heat and there's cold, there's always a loss of thermal energy. Mm-hmm. That's why some experts like to say that the loss of thermal energy is the most significant aspect of entropy, because the universe is only getting colder, right? So now imagine that these ice creams that I have, they're also melting. That means that the heat from the sun is causing the temperature of the ice creams to rise. Right. So somebody could say that actually the opposite is happening. But when you look at the larger picture, the star that is heating this entire system is dying. Yep. The star is a tiny hot speck in a freezing universe, right? When we look at, and to understand entropy in another way, again, and these are not full examples. There's big gaping holes because entropy is a sophisticated thing. You look up at the sky. That does help
to put it into perspective.
Yeah, when you look up at the sky, right, and you see the stars. So we see the stars and we see them spaced out, partially because we can't see the stars that are layered behind one another, right? But it's one way to think about, okay, if that were a super freezer that literally has the temperature of space, no matter how hot those stars are, if they're being stretched out by dark energy, and we know because of the redshift effect, for example, that stars are getting further and further apart. Star clusters are getting, star systems are getting, galaxies are further apart. Things that are keeping galaxies together are being stretched further apart. Well, when the heat sources are being stretched further apart by dark energy, and the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, the phenomenon of entropy, is causing heat energy to be lost, never to be transferred back, generally speaking. Well, that's why people postulate the heat death. So the idea of the Holy Quran is to focus on our finitude and the finitude of every particle of the universe. So the Holy Quran doesn't just talk about the inception of the universe and the Big Bang and the expanding universe and the fact that all of life has come from water and that there was a stage where it was coming from fire. We talk about deep sea vents and everything like that. At that time, who could imagine life coming from fire, right? But anyway, and the process of photosynthesis is mentioned in the Holy Quran, and the idea of wringing clay, that there was a time where life existed only in a clay-like substance. But anyways, because we like to dismiss all these things under the rug, rather than being like, why does each and every step exist in one singular book 1400 years ago?
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that, like, this concept of entropy is important simply because I just wanted to share some different examples that help me understand entropy, right? Because it comes down to my end. There's a subtle connection there. If the universe ends even hundreds of billions of years later, that means nothing to me. It's cool, hypothetically, but the Holy Quran talks about the finitude of even those things that will go on for a relatively infinite number of years compared to my own life. It says, look, don't ever think that you're going to live forever. The things that apparently appear to you like they're going to live forever, like the sun and the moon, within my life, they're eternal. If you think about it like that, right?
Yeah.
Within my life, these constants are eternal in my lifespan. But even they will end. And the reason the Holy Quran speaks about that on a spiritual, existential level is that we need to start thinking about our own end. And it's a very interesting case, and it's terrifying that of all the things that don't end, apparently, it's no longer in a usable form, right? Is information, data, information about what I used to do, information of the choices that I made. It's just something to think about, right?
Yeah.
So in this entire discussion, I think it's very, very fruitful to look at the other side as well.
You know, we've talked about the origin, and we've talked about death here, and recognizing our own vulnerability as you said it, finite beings. But let's talk a little bit, and a little bit to brighten up the room, a little bit about life, and some of the things that we have to consider in our life, kind of before that finite end that's destined for all of us. And I mean, it's interesting because first we're talking about multiverses, and now about evolution. But I wonder if anyone has even taken a step back from that ladder and thought, why has there even been a drive towards life? In a universe of entropy and disorder and randomness, why has the universe selected for life every single time? There's this evolutionary process that has not been able to kick out the universe's tendency towards life. So forget about postulating about multiverses. What about the microverses? The microverses upon microverses that we encounter every single day in the world around us, like the environment around us, for example, or even within us. And, you know, as a physician, I'm just mesmerized by some of the principles and the guiding ethical frameworks almost that are instilled within our biological being. I mean, take the example of the pancreas, right? Like the beta cells of the pancreas. It's very interesting because in the Quran, it says that a universal ethic that guides life alone. And I want every viewer to start thinking about the idea of fine-tuned life here, okay? But the universal ethic that guides life at the very basis of it is absolute justice. And it's that justice at every level. It's justice, we mean societal justice. You can think of it as legal justice. But homeostasis, equilibrium that we've already talked about. But when we look at the pancreas, if you have a little bit of sugar, well, the beta cells release some insulin. And it regulates. Your whole neuroendocrine axis is made to help you regulate towards functionality as well as survival. But the functionality part's important as well. But what happens, actually, when you have a little bit of sugar? Well, it turns out that your pancreas actually releases an excess of insulin, which I found very, very interesting. And there's been, the Fourth Caliph for our community has written about this, and I found the explanation to be so beautiful, which is that actually there isn't just justice, there's kindness. Because well, for the atheist, nature knows that it's very possible that you're going to have a lot of sugar or carbohydrates in a single meal. So an excess amount of insulin is given to you just in case, so you don't get sent into immediate hyperglycemia. There's this cushioning of kindness that nature has instilled within itself. Because you would think if there's only homeostasis and that's all there is to it, why does nature operate in this way? And we see examples of kindness in nature like this all the time. Look at the way our immune cell fights. Look at the way our immune system, our lymphoid system is. So it's very mesmerizing that I think that the fine-tuning of design doesn't just come down to the development of natural law, but there's ethical frameworks that are embedded within these natural systems. And it really puts into perspective when we bring in the idea of, and we talked about this in the first episode, that does consciousness exist outside of us, right? Like, is this a life force itself? So I just thought I'd bring in that interesting example that, I just am always mesmerized by it.
That's incredible. We talk about consciousness, and I think I have very rarely heard such a beautiful narrative where an organ of the human body shows or exhibits behaviors in its functionality that demonstrate something beyond just a cold, you think about evolution.
Right.
And the way that evolution is often talked about is in this cold, blind, totally scrupulous, uncaring kind of way, just choosing survival and whatnot, and that's it, and there's nothing in between. But there's a great deal of almost cellular morality that is exercised, right? In your organs, in your tissue, in the way that our organs cooperate with one another, when in many ways they shouldn't, and they couldn't. And then add to that the idea that we find kindness and benevolence and justice and love so important. Well, that connection, the fact that there is a connection between the two things, that we as conscious beings with consciousness and a conscience love kindness, love goodness, and then we see that replicated across what we think is mindless, like our own blood flow and one. I think that is an entire field that has never been touched upon. And if the scientific world were to investigate from this perspective, I'm sure we would find unbelievable acts of kindness that exist within nature from things that we thought were brainless.
Of course. And this, the cold-hearted aspect of evolution that you brought up, I think actually is very closely knit with some of the discourse in the physics community. And this is actually something that Dr. David Bohm brought up, who's a big inspiration of mine. I have his book sitting just here behind me. And he talks about how overarching day-to-day or generational ideologies are meta-narratives, essentially, that go over these large-scale societies, and they very much perforate the way we think about everyday life. Example is, nowadays, everything's mechanism. And you can see how this came with firstly Newtonian physics, but quantum just did the slam dunk, right? So everything's mechanism. So you can imagine that we have independent small pieces that all work together to create a large machine.
Yeah,
right?
Constituents, yeah.
Exactly. And yet, before that, this wasn't a concept at all. It wasn't intuitively even considered a concept. It was something known as organism rather than mechanism, where somewhat it's actually the whole, so you can bring this back to the human body, that regulates the local pieces within it. Without the whole, those independent pieces don't work. And think
they don't mean anything. They don't mean anything. Yeah.
Exactly. That's where meaning arises from.
Yeah.
And those local parts, those individual parts cannot function without the whole that comes down on a top-down model. And I think that's a good way to think about the universe as well, is we've stratified philosophically. I'm not postulating a physics theory here, but philosophically, we've seen everything as a set of external subatomic balls that are in chemical reactions, and they're all independent and nothing's related. There's no wholeness that exists in the universe. Well, I think a better way to think about it is that the universe regulates its substituents within it. And it helps us to think that way, because as that atom has expanded, every law within it has operated only in the context of the whole. Which, and I think I think the physics community needs to understand that although they think that these theories that are talked about, these mathematical concepts that are talked about, are reserved just for, these expert scientists, they have because they're fundamental theories, they have huge implications on the way society sees each other. I mean, nowadays, look at the sense of individuality. There is no community sense. Everyone's an individual constituent, and you're external to one another, and, you go get your own. And I don't doubt that there's a link between one worldview, which starts even at the level of origin or science, and another worldview, which has now perforated society. I thought that was a very interesting narrative to bring up.
That's very, very interesting. See, I'd like to touch on like that one aspect about the universe. And it's funny because when you start talking about the universe like that, and there's a great deal of there's a number of agnostics and atheists who are willing to come to the point where they'll talk about the universe possibly being conscious in some grand sense. Right. Like something like an organ breathing in and out, an organ on autopilot. Take the heart, for example. So they'll acknowledge at least that much, and that's important because genius is only your own rejected thoughts that return to you with a certain alienated majesty. And what you've said about this top-down model, it always reminds me of Werner Heisenberg, who said the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And when it comes to people who are actually studying, looking at these particles, watching the reactions happen in the laboratory, the ones on the other end of the actual telescope feed now because of the James Webb and whatnot, they are not atheists, a vast majority of them, in the sense that they reject the entire concept of a creator or a consciousness from which we originate. Most of them are atheists in that they have rejected the classical, usually Christian concept of God. And that's people like Einstein. Why are there huge debates? I see no matter how many points you bring up about Einstein, both sides will try to claim him. No, he believed in God. The other ones will, no, he definitely didn't believe in God. But when you go through, even Darwin, people will quote letters, from the end of his life that show that he believes in some concept of God. They began with a certain concept of God that Christianity offered, the modern Christianity, which we believe was a corrupted form, with due respect. Then some aspect of science opened their eyes, and they realized that concept is not true. That's not true. So it's like, in that moment, they suddenly realized does that mean there is no God? But as they continue to study and learn more and more and study the various aspects of their own discipline, by the end of their lives, they're starting to go back to the idea that, wait, there has to be something more to this origin. That's what I mean by that famous quote that genius is only our own rejected thoughts, previously rejected thoughts that return to us with a certain alienated majesty.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to speculate out of what I think is appropriate, but even when we talk about the horsemen, like we talk about the people who are at the frontiers, the frontiers of modern atheism. Yeah. And we've talked about this earlier, that, no matter what they say, they designated pretty much their entire lives into the concept of God, because it is something that I genuinely think they're still curious about. And there's that inkling of curiosity within each of us, no matter how much we try to deny. Yeah. When we see the miracles around us, which we touched on in the last episode, or when we see the genius by design, there's this natural curiosity to wonder that, is it just human beings at the top of all of this, at the top of our psychological hierarchies, or is there a power above? And I think that curiosity exists for everyone. It has to. And without that curiosity, I genuinely believe there's a very, very dangerous road of a true pessimistic nihilism, of an indifference to the suffering of fellow human beings, of an indifference to the possibly tragic outcomes of human society. So to some degree, this scientific curiosity has a very deep and profound overlap with the way we conceptualize social society again. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier. So, I mean, I also do recognize that we're coming near the end of the episode. So I want to finish with that thought, that curiosity towards design, that curiosity towards God. That's, I think, very, very much embedded even within the modern atheist. What do you have to say about that? And we can wrap it up from there.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the conversation, which, by the way, this conversation may be ending our conversation, but the whole purpose is for the viewers around the world to actually use this as a beginning of the conversation, right? And I always say that somewhere between the zealousness of the believers and the obsession of the atheists, this conversation about God is not going anywhere, because it's the zealousness of certain believers, I'm talking about both extremes, not the average person, in God. And it's the new atheists, the four horsemen of the apocalypse as they're self-proclaimed,
Right.
their obsession with God that keeps this conversation as relevant as it is today. And no matter what happens, every time there's a real scientific discovery about space exploration, subatomic particles, something that challenges our current understanding of of physics, of chemistry, of biology, some aspect or another of the article will trace it back to God. What does that have to say about the concept of a creator, of a God? Because we are intrinsically woven to need to know that. And that's why here at the Existence Project, we love to say that sometimes the greatest evidence for water in the absence of water isn't water. It's thirst.
I couldn't end it on more perfect words. Thank you so much. So for the viewers watching this today, well, this is a different type of conversation. This is a global conversation. And we've gotten feedback from people around the world. So please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We want to engage with you. We want to keep this conversation going. And let us know what you'd like to see in future episodes. So for today, it's been great having this chat with you, Sabahat, and I'll see you next time. Take care.